Well, we'll call the May 10th, 2021 special meeting of the CCP to order. Madam Clerk, would you please take the roll?
Member Fruitnick,
Present.
Member Vega, she is absent. Member Saylor is absent. Member Raymond.
Here.
Thank you. Member Olson.
Here.
Member Johnson.
Here.
Member Miller.
Here.
Member Larson.
Here.
Thank you. Member Evans.
Here.
Member Lewis.
Here.
Member Nigel is absent. And Member Valdez. You're muted, but I see that you're here.
Present.
Thank you.
Thank you. Little housekeeping. Today's meeting of the CCP is being held telephonically pursuant to the Governor's Executive Order number N2920, issued on March 17th, 2020. The order allows governing bodies of local agencies to hold their meetings electronically, provided that members of the public can also observe and provide public comment electronically. A few guidelines: other than CCP members, all lines will be muted and unmuted by the moderator. CCP members, please state your name when you wish to speak. It'll help everybody know who's talking. And if you would like to speak, please just briefly let me know or raise your hand, either virtually or actually raise your hand on screen, and I will recognize you and you'll have the floor. We will have public comment after each agendized item. The first action item is number 2, consider approval of the agenda. Hopefully everyone's seen it. And if it's okay, we can get a motion to approve.
I'll second.
Okay, so first by Miller and second by Garth. With that, can I get a roll call, please?
Member
Roll call
Fruitnick.
vote. Yes.
Member Vega is absent. Member Saylor is absent. Member Raven.
Yes.
Member Olson.
Yes.
Member Johnson.
Yes.
Member Miller.
Yes.
Member Larson.
Yes.
Member Evans.
Yes.
Member Lewis.
Yes.
Member Nigel is absent, and Member Valdez.
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes.
Next up is number 3, consider approval of the April 12th, 2021 meeting minutes. If there's no issues with the meeting minutes, we'll go through a motion and vote again, please.
I'll make a motion.
Okay,
I'll second.
so Tracy first, Dale seconded it. Can we get a roll call vote, please?
Member Fruitnick.
Yes.
Member Vega is absent. Member Saylor is absent. Member Raven.
Yes.
Member Olson.
Yes.
Member Johnson.
Yes.
Member Miller.
Yes.
Member Larson.
Yes.
Member Evans.
Yes.
Member Lewis.
Yes.
Member Nigel is absent, and Member Valdez.
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes.
Agenda item number 4, public comment. Opportunity for members of the public to address the CCP on subjects related to CCP business and not otherwise on the agenda. Do we have any public comment?
There are no hands raised.
Agenda item number 5, member announcements. Does anybody have any announcements they would like to brief the group on? Not seeing any. We'll move on to number 6, receive revised CCP budget ad hoc recommendation. This will be with Eric.
Perfect. So good afternoon, CCP members and members of the public. Eric Will, CCP analyst. Today's meeting will continue our discussion of the CCP budget and moving forward with the concept of the percentage-based budget. After the meeting on April 12th, the CCP ad hoc looked to revise the option that was presented to this group and subsequently laid out 3 options in the memo that was released last week as part of the agenda. Today, I'll provide a quick, brief overview of the options and will entertain any questions or feedback regarding these options as we look forward. At this time, if we could just bring up the Excel spreadsheet, the attachment A, Lupita. Are we able to bring up the spreadsheet, Lupita?
Yes, sorry, Eric. I was
Oh,
trying
no.
to put Supervisor Provenza as a panelist.
Oh, no
Supervisor
problem.
Saylor.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so this is, if we could bring up I apologize, the full spreadsheet, so it'd be attachment A of the agenda packet. My apologies, there's multiple spreadsheets. Perfect, thank you so much. Okay, so if we could zoom in, if it's possible, on option 1 a little bit. Perfect. Okay. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, so first is we have these 3 options for the CCP budget. These are all included within the agenda packet, so I hope everyone is able to access that and see the tiny little numbers a little bit easier. If not, I'm sure we can find another solution. I realize there's a lot going on in the spreadsheet. But I'll just give a quick overview of the 3 options, and then at that point, once we're finished with that overview, we can have a discussion about the options presented at this time. So in general, I want to note that after the April 12th meeting, we at the CCP budget ad hoc looked at revising the timeline for the budget shift. So originally proposed as a 1-year fiscal change, looking to move over to a 3-year timeline to allow for more time for budgets to react to the changes within the proposal of the percentage-based budget. So looking first at option 1, we see this 3-year timeline to shift budgets toward a similar outcome as was developed for the previous option back on April 12th. However, we will note that the year-over-year shifts in budget are less substantial and provide budget coverage through innovation funds and uncommitted fund balances funds for fiscal year 21-22. So if you look at the bottom of option 1, there's actually a row for uncommitted, for reserved, and then fund balance. So we broke that out this time to really illustrate the different pieces of the budget, looking at the base budget as opposed to including everything into one pot. So for option 1, we're currently looking at this 3-year timeline, as I mentioned, looking at year-over-year shifts, taking a smaller hit than what we saw on April 12th, looking at a 5% reserve. So this would be approximately $450,000 would be proposed, as was discussed previously with the CCP, looking to see if a reserve policy was possible. This would leave us with approximately $864,000 and fund balance to cover budget gaps looking forward over the next several years. For option 2, we have a similar 3-year timeline, but fiscal year 21-22 matches more closely to the 33-33-33 model basis that was discussed back in April. So looking at the 33% going to probation, 33% to the sheriff, and then the rest of the budget is split up into 33%. By fiscal year 23-24, there are just minimal differences between option 1 and 2, as we can see here, particularly in the probation department and innovation line items. The reserve and fund balance proposal remains the same as option 1. For option 3, this is actually very similar to what was proposed back in April although the budget ad hoc has included the fund balance, reserve, and uncommitted line items to this option as well, just to provide what that option looks like within the context of this additional information that we're discussing today. So at this time, I want to offer the CCP an opportunity, any questions for staff for a discussion about the budget line items or about the budget items themselves. I will mention that staff is looking to build out these budgets further. So as opposed to just having treatment or innovation line items, actually looking at the specific programs and the what the dollars are being spent on to offer both the CCP members and the public the most information possible, as opposed to just these conglomerated percentages for the budget. So at this time, I'll take any questions or any comments and feedback about the budget items proposed today.
Erica or whoever's, Dan, how do you want to conduct the questioning and discussion? Chief Fruitnick. You want questions just directed to Eric, or do you want to remaster this in some fashion?
Yeah, just we'll go. You can have the floor at the moment, just since you're first, and then we'll just go by whoever would like to speak. But the floor is yours, Supervisor Saylor.
Okay, thank you. So one of the challenges that we've got with the focus on percentages and large labels like treatment, probation, public defender, et cetera, is we don't know what's behind the current spending. And I think as we look at what treatment might entail in this configuration, we probably should also have a pretty clear picture about what the money has been spent for in the past year and the current year. And there should be no difference in a dollar going one place or another in terms of our level of information and scrutiny. So I think it's going to be important for us to understand that. It's very possible that some things that are being done, Jim and I've talked a little bit about this, some things being done by probation or the public defender or the sheriff might be classified as treatment if we see what they are. Other things that have become a part of the base budget for the departments should stand on their own, whether those dollars should continue to be invested in exactly the way they have been in the past. I think it's a healthy organization that continues to look at what's the best way to spend the money in order to address the goals, objectives of the strategic plan and the initial statutory authorization for the program. So that's going to be of interest to me at least, and I hope to everybody. There, Eric, if there's a question in there, it is what level of information do we have on the spending in the base, and can we how difficult would it be for the CCP to see that and make some assessments of efficacy of the current spending and promise of future plans?
Absolutely. So what I would say first off is that earlier this year, we did an exercise with this group where everyone, all of the CCP members did provide what they have been spending their money on over the past year. And so unfortunately, that information is not included in this packet, but it is available. And we do have that base information to get us started. In terms of comparison of best use of dollars, I think there'd certainly be some work to be done. But I think we do have that historic data, thanks to everyone here at the CCP and getting that all together, I think back in February for our special budget meeting in March.
Eric, one thing that would be helpful, I know we've talked a couple times and you did mention not necessarily using the category of treatment because we're not sure what fits into that. But to me, it would make sense to look at alternatives to incarceration, and treatment would be part of many of those alternatives to incarceration, but not necessarily all. That would be an easier division because we're looking at individuals incarcerated or programs and measures to avoid incarceration. And that might make it, I think, easier to see how we're spending programmatically as opposed to department by department.
So just to make sure I can clarify, that would be to use alternatives to incarceration as the actual bucket itself, as opposed to treatment, if I understand.
Right. Right, because that would entail anything anybody is doing to keep people out of the jail. And all the various programs and efforts that we have ongoing. And to me, that would be more meaningful than just taking, one aspect of it. Although, as I mentioned, treatment is maybe an integral part of everything or most things. It isn't the whole ball game. So we should be aware what each department is doing in terms of alternatives to incarceration and how, and look at the budget in those two terms. I'm interested in looking at things programmatically as opposed to what department should get more money. There may be, and I think there are some things that we're doing between departments where several departments are working on the same thing. So to me, it's easier to fund by program. It may not be possible this year, but over time to look at what we're actually doing and what we want to do, as opposed to which departments get how much money.
Can I say something? There were a lot of different ways to go about this, what we were tasked with doing, which is coming up with some sustainable budget over time. We looked initially at programs. Like we thought when we first got together, we'd be discussing programs and what we thought should be cut and what we thought should be kept, and et cetera. And then we realized that we were just 5 people in this big group. And maybe that wasn't, putting our values on everybody else wasn't maybe the smartest thing. But it would have been fine. We just didn't do it that way. What we decided to do instead, why we settled on this percentage-based budgeting, is we looked back at things that we knew we failed at in the past. What we failed at in the past was actually collecting meaningful data on all of these programs. We rarely have kept each other accountable through that data. We hardly ever in the past had these conversations timely enough to make a difference to cut programs when we lost money. And we realized that maybe what the best thing to do is to let the subject matter experts of each department, so the sheriff, probation, public defender, DA, treatment, et cetera, let those subject matter experts spend the money that they get in the way that they can effectuate the outcomes of AB 109 cleanest. So rather than coming back every year and saying we lost $100,000, what are we going to cut? We just decided if it was percentage based, everybody would have some level of assurance as to what their money was going to be next year, but also would have to share in if there was any cuts. We also wanted to design it so that we had to purposely look at the formulas for money and plan accordingly. So for instance, we know that you get more money if you send less second strikers to prison this year over last year. We know that to be true. We've never purposely and affirmatively created a program to maximize dollars under these formulas. So we thought that having a treatment and an innovation fund would incentivize all departments and city agencies and CBOs to participate in what it's going to take to meet these goals. So we fully believe that at the end of the day, treatment's got to be voted on above and beyond what we're already spending by the CCP to make sure that everybody's going in the same direction. And it could easily be that what you guys are saying, both of your supervisors, Firenze and Saylor, what you said is that probation could be doing things that are considered treatment, and then the CCP as a whole could agree to spend extra money and put it there. But without incentivizing these buckets of money, we weren't sure how we were going to align what the CCP is supposed to be doing and what we're actually doing. So that was kind of some of the thinking behind going percentage-based rather than program by program. And And then what we wanted to make sure we did every year is collect good data. So what the ad hoc had said that we would do, if everyone wants us to, is to come up with forms and come up with a protocol and come up with timelines and come up with everything that's required to actually have a meaningful look at data going forward. So that if you give the public defender's office 5% and I don't spend it in a way that everyone thinks is aligned with AB 109, you have the power to adjust my budget the next year. And that'd be true for every department. So I don't know if there's a right or a wrong way to go about this, but there's certainly room to look at the data and look at the spending more than what's in the spreadsheet, and that's contemplated. It's just not contemplated that the 5 of us are going to make value judgments on everyone else's specific programs.
Well, I wonder is the pretrial, the probation's pretrial release, is that a treatment program?
I don't know. I mean, it would depend what CCP decided, right? So we know that we're already spending about $1 million or so in treatment, and that's on residential and et cetera for actual treatment and counseling. So it's the additional money that the CCP would have to get together and decide if what we thought was a definition. We tried to give some examples because there was a request last time to have some examples, but that again, that's just 5 of us. So if the CCP thinks that pretrial diversion is treatment and wants to allocate money to pretrial diversion, they can do that by vote. If we think that it's important to, fund an IGT house or similar houses because capacity for housing is more important, we could call that treatment. But those are value judgments that the bigger group's going to have to decide. At least that's how we contemplated it, is the bigger group would decide those things.
So the bigger group's going to be making value judgments, whether we do the percentage approach or a programmatic approach. The bigger group is going to have to make some judgments, and then the group that actually votes on budget and the CCP plan is a smaller group, which isn't the subcommittee. It's the original executive committee, as I understand it.
Yeah, I think the 7. So there was some assurance that every department would get some money, and we were trying to align value-wise of do we value treatment over supervision or over incarceration, or do we value it equally? And so the plan was to kind of come up with something that would recognize that we needed jail beds, recognize we needed supervision, but really align what we wanted to do going forward with rehabilitation, and then put in the supports that could make that possible.
Do we know the percentage that is needed? For example, part of the CCP evaluation was for housing additional people that that would be housed locally, that used to be housed at the state. Do we know how much of a percentage it takes to do that versus what we're spending now on incarceration from these funds?
Dale and Matt were on here. We have data in the Sheriff's Department about jail bed days for AB 109 inmates, but we don't have data as to which portion of those were post-sentencing, because before AB 109, the same folks were in the jail. So really, we're talking about AB 109 impacts. And then I don't know if this has the actual jail bed days for post-sentencing for those serving their prison sentences.
So we don't have that? I was just talking about the people that we didn't have in jail prior to 109, that we have because of 109, so that we know how much of the spending is justified in terms of incarceration.
Dale, do you have that?
Well, I don't have that complete data right there, but I'll tell you that it's the comparison between state beds and county beds is going to be different. So I can try to look into that and get those numbers for you.
Okay, that would be helpful.
And wouldn't that be, so with the reduction in jail population overall, I'm not sure how calculate added cost for housing inmates, because the overall is down.
Yeah, I was just trying to look at the AB 109 as paying for the people that were formerly state inmates. Well, they're I guess they're still in a way, but they're housed locally. And there's a finite population that under prior law would have been a state inmate that are now a county inmate. And so that to me would be where the funding for incarceration would be justified. Or at least one way of looking at it. And then how much beyond that is there for alternatives to incarceration?
I wonder when we, and I can't recall the line item budget elements that were presented earlier this year that Eric mentioned. But I wonder if were there actual dollars for that purpose identified in the budget, or were they identified for other purposes and just have been subsumed within the operating budget of the Sheriff's Department?
Good question.
I can take a look into that.
Well, all of the sheriff's allocation, except for electronic monitoring, is for jail beds.
Okay.
Others? Not necessarily seeing any. One of my thoughts is the ad hoc group has done a great job of getting us down the road, but I really would like to see more of a line item budget specifically, and maybe Laura, my fiscal person, could help with that. For instance, if we look at option 2, 21-22 fiscal year, we do have 1.6 million in treatment funds, but just a rough calculation off the top of my head is probably 1.2 of that's already allocated with the day reporting center, with normal treatment, for lack of a better term, for mental health court grant match, for the IGT houses. So I would really like to see more of a line by line breakdown. I mean, I think that would leave us around 400,000 left over in treatment, but just a little bit more detail to really paint a bigger picture on everything. But I don't know, I know that's a lot of work for the ad hoc group, so that's why I'd like to volunteer Laura potentially to assist with that.
Well, option 1, you can see currently we're spending $1.3 million in that line item. And if we went with option 1, it would be an additional, move it up to 2.1. So you're asking how much more money would be available, or are you asking how much money is already committed?
Kind of what's been committed. I'm assuming we'll vote to continue with what's been allocated to those sources already, but just more of just a true breakout of the budget. I'm probably not articulating my thoughts super clear on that, but
I think all that information has already been submitted by Eric several months ago. So does everyone just want like another spreadsheet? All that information's been distributed.
for me, I'd like to see just, again, maybe I'm just such a visual learner, the different options, the different years, and what the impacts would potentially be on those. Again, I know it's a lot of work. That's why I'm volunteering us to potentially do it.
Well, Chief, I think that I'm sympathetic. I'm personally sympathetic to having the additional detail. I would also ask that it be done for those elements of the base budget, because it's the same question. What's the money being directed toward? And I don't think there should be. I think the burden of evidence should reside equally with whoever the budget manager. What is it that we're spending the money on, whether it's the sheriff's department or the Health and Human Service Agency. So I think if we're going to look at the treatment line, which makes sense to break that out and understand it, we should do the same with the other agencies and programs. And I think that would be appropriate and equal scrutiny.
Anybody else? And then I'll open it up to public comment.
Yeah, actually, if I can chime in. I mean,
Go ahead, Sean.
Yogi Berra said it's like deja vu all over again. So if I'm understanding what correctly, that the work that went into this is based on a moot point. We want to go back to how we've been doing it for the last 5 years that I've been sitting on it, 4.5. You know, the idea of this concept was work, you know, live within your means, and so we can stop arguing pointlessly about the budgeting. Because that's all that this ends up being every year, year after year.
So this is Jonathan. I had sent out that fourth proposal, Eric, and I thought you had said you were going to try to put that up on a spreadsheet because I'd like to see that fourth proposal be included.
Before we do that, can I just say something? This is Karen. Sorry, I didn't have my video on for a minute. I feel like we're going down a rabbit hole again with this conversation. The budget ad hoc was tasked with coming up with options. We have now gone back several times and adjusted those options based on everyone's feedback. And then to be asked to go back and again and get more information doesn't feel right. If the whole CCP wanted to make the decision, we probably shouldn't have had a budget ad hoc that everyone chose. And we've already looked at all the data from the past year, the budget data, the program level data, the outcomes or lack thereof. And so it feels like we're spinning our wheels again and not having a productive conversation about moving this budget forward in the way it was intended, in line with the spirit of the legislation, where treatment is prioritized as well as our law enforcement partners.
Karen, it seems like we've always had a allocation kind of department by department, and that maybe in this approach, maybe the difficulty is that it's continuing that, but just trying to set percentages rather than focusing on programs and what we actually want to accomplish. And one of the things in my mind is I see big cuts, say, for probation, and I don't know what those cuts mean. I don't know, there's a dollar amount, but what wouldn't happen if that money wasn't allocated? Would their pretrial release program go away? Would we repopulate the jail because pretrial release was going away with people waiting for trials? I don't know. And then that's just an example.
I think that we're conflating two different items, Supervisor Provenza. I think, and we talked about this a little bit at last month's meeting, when AB 109 happened and the CCP started here in Yolo County, it was right after the last big economic downturn, and we absolutely used AB 109 dollars to make county positions whole to save county general fund. And I think what the budget ad hoc is trying to do, and what we've all agreed, is that CCP should pay for what AB 109 was intended for. And then there are another series of decisions about what county general fund should pay for.
I understand that, but it's important then to know, you could look at the two sides, incarceration and alternatives to incarceration. And it was intended to cover both, and we have programs that cover both. So it would be, to me, instructive to look at the programs we have and determine whether we're spending the money correctly or not in that way. And if there's programs that aren't working, get rid of them.
Yeah, I think we're just trying to make the first decision, which is percentage-based budgeting the right answer for CCP, and which of the percentages make sense? And then the departments, rather than the budget ad hoc or someone outside of the department, would have to make decisions about which programs may or may not be eligible to fit in other line items or potentially be funded in other ways. And that's why we really built into, especially option one, that this coming fiscal year would be able to absorb some of other funds to make themselves whole while they figured that out over the course of the next fiscal year. That was our hope, because we definitely don't want anyone to lose their jobs or be laid off.
We're also trying to, like I said, incentivize so that people are spending their money in the way that AB 109 envisions. I mean, it's not, I don't think, as simple as saying, what's an AB 109 cost? Therefore, we'll pay for it. I think it's more of what do you want AB 109 to pay for? Do you want to emphasize treatment? Do you want to emphasize incarceration? Do you want to emphasize pretrial? I mean, it's trying to put our money in the things that are going to get us the outcomes that we're looking for, rather than just saying, raise your hand if you have an AB 109 cost and how much is it? So we're trying to do that too. And maybe, you know, we're not, I don't know. That was the intent. That was the intent.
And then, of course, Don and I have to vote on the whole budget. So if there's something that happens here that affects the entire budget, and it's something that has to be paid for, then that's an impact on the general fund in a year. Although we have money to spend one time from COVID, we're going to have a tight budget year this year and for this foreseeable future.
Dale, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just think we have a right to question. Obviously, probation and the sheriff's offices are taking a pretty big impact over this course of this proposal on the percentage-based scenario. And I think we have a right to ask questions of the ad hoc committee for itemized line items that are going to be paid out of this. I do know that back in 2011, you know, when the AB 900 project was designated, you know, part of the responsibility was a plan for adequate facility staffing. And a part of that, and I'll read directly from it, funding for the staffing will rely on the Yolo County General Fund, public safety funding, and AB 109 allocations, period. So I do know that staffing was a part of the AB 109 initiative back then for the sheriff's office. So going from 36% down to 25% is a substantial loss for the sheriff's office. So I just think we're open to wanting to get things done. I understand the impacts that everybody wants to try to be successful here. I know Jonathan has another option. I think we can look at that other option if that's available.
We do have that option. Lupita, would you mind bringing it up? That was that Excel spreadsheet from earlier. Perfect. And Jonathan, if you'd like to provide any comments on this from the DA's perspective, I'd welcome that.
So, you know, as I said in that note, the DA stands to stay the same or maybe even gain if it's 5%. So we don't stand to lose anything here. But, you know, what Karen said is exactly right, that during the Great Recession, we used this money to fill the budgets of backfill of probation and the sheriff. And so that puts them in a very precarious position when we're cutting them millions of dollars. And my concern was with those huge cuts that we were going to walk out of here today with no budget once again. And that's why I wanted to try to build on the hard work of the ad hoc committee to develop something that maybe would be more palatable in terms of budget losses. You know, one of the things I want to mention is we probably should have had probation or the sheriff on that ad hoc committee, and we really didn't select that ad hoc committee. 3 people volunteered very quickly, and when I volunteered, I couldn't serve because of the Brown Act. But we probably, you know, would have been good for you guys to have had input in terms of what kind of hits probation and the sheriff would take, and which of those hits would be AB 109 money. You know, one of the things that I've said numerous times and others have, including Chief Miller, is, our mission talks about public safety. So that's something we have to think about. That being said, I agree. We really need more funding and treatment. We're all doing a lot of treatment, but we need to increase that budget line item as well as innovation. So, that's why, I thought maybe this would be another proposal that might work out, because I don't want to walk out of here today, or whether it's another meeting with nothing done, because that's what we've been doing for, countless meetings over the last few years. And I know everyone's frustrated with that. So that was kind of my thoughts in terms of putting a fourth proposal together.
Yes, Daniel?
Thank you, Chief. Again, I'm new to this process, but I think this is what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that there is a kind of universal agreement that we should be shifting our monies from incarceration to treatment. That's a major paradigm shift. And I think there's also universal agreement that we should be landing on a methodology where we're going to do percentage allocation. And again, these are two big shifts that people seem to be agreeing on. So I think that's momentous in that sense. I think the questions are how quickly we make that shift, whether it's 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year, and ultimately what the percentage shift is going to land on. And even with all the different options, they're pretty similar. And we're talking about a percentage or two off. And what I'm hearing from our board members is that in theory, this works, but we don't understand what we currently spend the monies on. And we'd like to know what the implications are for each option in terms of what we lose in terms of service and what we gain in terms of service. And that's really important to know the interaction, because if we lose something on probation, that may have an adverse effect on something else with the sheriff or with the DA or the like. So we have to kind of understand all of those things to look at it from a holistic kind of viewpoint. So that's what I'm hearing. Maybe I've got that wrong, but it would seem like in terms of next steps, no one's saying we're changing anything or revisiting. All we're trying to do is find out what exactly we're funding and what the implications are. And that'll help people make a more informed decision about which allocation methodology to use ultimately.
Chair, this is John Miller, and Chairman.
Go ahead, Chief Miller.
Okay, so we did ask each department, as part of this ad hoc committee, we asked each department to prepare a document explaining how their money was spent. So that's already been explored. We also had that organization come in. Was it last year, year before COVID? Forgot that organization. Part of the county association. Refresh my memory. What was that organization called?
That's CSAC.
CSAC, thank you. CSAC came in about 4 years ago. We went through a process during the budget, having each department present to the committee verbally and by PowerPoint, I recall, how they spend the money. So those exercises have already been done.
Well, I'm interested in hearing more about what the rationale is for this option 4, Jonathan. You're ready?
Yeah.
The idea is you want to move to a framework that people can agree to, and then move on. Is that basically the idea?
Yeah, that's a good question, Supervisor Saylor. I want to move to a framework that works and then move on. So I'm concerned that we may be unable to do that. It doesn't impact our office because we're going to take an increase, but it has dire impacts on probation and the sheriff, which is what I'm really concerned about because of what we did when we built this budget originally during the Great Recession. So, I've said a couple times, if the will of the board and the CAO is to backfill what they lose and what is necessary with general fund dollars, that's one thing, but I haven't heard anything from the board or the CAO that they're willing to do that at this point. So that's my concern. I thought this was something where those departments would take a bigger hit initially in year one, and in year one, we do have some funding to cover them, but then it would stay consistent. And so at year three, their decrease would not be as great as in the other proposals. And so you can see that each of the different other line items were reduced, including, I reduced the DA and also public defenders, you can see, reduced admin because I hadn't heard any rationale as to why we needed 3% or even 2% for admin. So that's the proposal that I thought might work and be viable. And it's up to the executive board as to whether they're interested in going forward with this or whether we want to do something different.
I can fill in a couple blanks. Administration, we thought, so administration is half the CAO position, that's half the air. We thought that we probably needed better financial support. So we thought that we could maybe take advantage of probation's financial guru and pay for part of her position. And we also knew that we needed probably some central location to collect data and collect data on a regular basis. And so that would also be administration, and that could be housed at probation or whoever wants to take it on, Health and Human Services, it doesn't matter. So that's where the administration was came from. Treatment, I mean, I do respect, Jonathan, what you tried to do. I think that it's too much of a hit for the first year for probation. That's over $700,000 they're going to have to cut by September. But the intent for one of the other options that we had kind of favored was really bulking up treatment so that people could apply and innovate and come up with new programs. If we only have treatment move from 1.3 to $1.6 million, we're kind of just status quo on treatment with a little bit around the margins. We're not really doing anything much different. I mean, personally, I like option one, which leaves probation at 28% and then treatment and sheriff at 25% with some other stuff here and there. But if you can put back up the first option on the screen, the first three options on the screen, I wanted to point out we still have, see where it says the fund balance, uncommitted, we have $800 and something thousand that we also thought that the CCP needed to have input on what to do with. And that's because we have a fund balance right now. So we wanted to make this sustainable so that like Chief Miller said, everybody has to live within their means. You know exactly what that's going to be. The only wild card is what's going to be the base. If we get more growth, then everyone's money goes up. If you get less growth, everyone's money goes down. But we do have that uncommitted $864,000 that can be used to smooth over this transition in any way CCP chooses, in addition to treatment, in addition to innovation. Option one is the only one that we thought people could manage as far as cuts by September. And then we wanted to make it as soft landing as possible over time, knowing that those three, for lack of a better term, slush funds, innovation, treatment, and reserves. And we also wanted to commit to keeping a reserve. So we haven't talked yet about what happens, like, let's say I get money, let's say I get $10, but I only spent $8. Do I keep $2 the following year? Does it stay in my line item, or does it go back to the general fund for redistribution? We haven't talked about that yet either. Frankly, there's a lot of escape valves in here to bulk up some people's losses over time, if that's what CCP chooses to do, so that there aren't big hits at any given year.
So it looks like, and I think isn't one of the things is you would take an action for the 21-22 budget with the understanding there's a framework for future years, but this decision wouldn't lock in those future years because it's an annual budget process So after any one, no matter which one of these or whatever other approach is taken for 21, 22, you come back, you see how it worked, you assess it, you decide what comes in the subsequent budget years. So if you were to take option 1 or option 4 for the first year, and you say, oh my goodness, calamity happened, then you can reassess. Or if you say, you know what, there were some real opportunities that emerged as a result of this, let's continue the course. So you're not necessarily committing to the out year other than as a concept for the planning framework is the point. So that's one escape. And the second is that if you have the treatment and the innovation funds available, then there's an incentive for any of the departments to move forward with ideas to improve the lot of the strategic plan efficacy. In fact, I think is that an accurate assessment, or am I missing something?
I mean, I think so. I think we anticipated from the ad hoc that these changes in percentages over time would be the assumption. But there are obviously every year you can change what you do if circumstances change. The reason at least 5% in reserve is we didn't want, let's say we have a perfectly great program in pretrial services going with probation, but we had a weird base year and all our money went down. Rather than lay someone off 1 year and then rehire them the next year, we had money in reserve to make sure that we could ride out volatility as in addition to expecting people to stay within their means based on their base budget percentages.
In terms of the general fund stepping in for, I think that for anything that we see coming forward with a request from the general fund would have to have a rationale that was compelling, and so it's not necessarily simply we're going to do everything we've been doing, and it's just a question of where the money comes from. It's more a question of wherever the money is drawn from, it needs to be substantiated. The necessity needs to be substantiated.
Go ahead, Daniel. Oh, you're on mute, sir.
Thank you, Chief. Just want to clarify a couple of things. One, with respect to the budgeting process, I'm told that by DFS that with respect to any decision made today, if there is a decision made today, we wouldn't be able to load it into the budget for this time. We'd have to delay it until recommended budget or the approved budget process, which was later in the year, in the late summer. So there is no rush to get this submitted right now. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think it's intriguing, the idea of using the innovation funds. So for example, if probation were losing funding based on the methodology, hypothetically probation could request some of the funds from the innovation fund to cover some of those expenses. My question though is one of timing, because we'd have to know what the CCP decides with respect to those requests quickly so that we can make a decision on whether or not the board wants to use general fund to cover that if CCP decides not to. And I'm not sure exactly the mechanics of that.
Well, if you went on option 1, there is no appreciable difference between innovation between current and option 1 the first year, because we were allocating all of that additional money to keep probation and sheriff's percentages higher. So those decisions would really start coming into play in years 2 and 3. So as for instance, probation and sheriff's money went down, innovation goes up. And so there could be some leveling off, but it would have to be through an application process to the CCP as to what they want to use the money for and whether or not it's aligned with AB 109 goals, et cetera. And that's kind of same true with treatment as well. Treatment would get a bigger jump in the first year, but it gets it by the third year, it's pretty significant. least under option one. And then ad hoc committed to whether it's the same membership or not, and if we want an ad hoc anymore, or we just want to do it as a big group. But at least getting the infrastructure in place, like I said, the forms and the protocols and the staffing, and, you know, Laura from Dan's Fruitnick's department to do the administration, and we offset some of that, and we can work with her to come up with what these forms look like and what the submission deadlines would look like. But those are all things that I think we can put in place over the next few months, and it'd be fine.
While everybody's thinking, I'll open it up for a public comment on this agenda item. Lupita, do we have any public comment?
There are no hands raised.
Well, that was short, so I'll turn it back over to the CCP members.
This is Jonathan. I'd like to hear from probation and sheriff about, how they're feeling about those cuts and what we'd be cutting in terms of, the services provided at each of those departments with the cuts we're seeing in year one for option one.
Yeah, I can start. We've been running some projections this last week internally to figure out the effects on everything on the various options. Year one for any of the options outside option three, which is it's just such a huge hit. We could put some things into place. I have a couple of unfunded or funded but unfilled positions that I could change things up a little bit for any of those options. We'd have to request a little bit of treatment things that we're currently doing. The NCCT contract comes to mind. I'd want to shift that over to the CCP potentially. And we can make year one, it's painful, some of those options, but we could figure it out. Where it really comes to be is in year three, when it kind of drops off, assuming that I could get a position or two funded in some sort of treatment mechanism with CCP funding, the end result is about 5 positions that I would have to drop off the roster by year three. Now, we could do that through attrition, hopefully. I mean, no one wants to be laid off, and no one on here wants to go through that process. But the end result is, at the end of it, I'm looking at about five positions down. Now, I would probably take a couple out of adult supervision, I'd have to, and potentially 1 or 2 out of pretrial as well, to kind of just ensure that there are functions moving forward that we've had for all these years and do great work. But that's kind of how it would affect us in year three. Again, year one, we'll make whatever work with any of the options. But year three is where it really gets interesting with, any way you look at it, with option 1, 2, and 3, and we're down $1.6 million in year three without losing bodies. I don't think I can bridge that $1.6 million. And that's just kind of a 30,000 foot overview. If there's questions, if not, I'll turn it over to Dale.
Well, like you, Dan, it's I don't want to sound like I'm doom and gloom here, but it is positions. And we're looking at a lot of positions that we're required to have, through the BSCC to have at our facility. And then what are we going to do with those positions? We're currently almost fully staffed with correctional officers right now. I think we're just a couple positions down right now. But by the end of this third year, I don't know what we're going to do, how impactful it's going to be, but we're going to have quite a few positions we're going to have to lay off. And that's not something I'm looking forward to, or not something the sheriff is looking forward to. And I just know that when this came about in 2011, again, what was said to us and what was allocated for us on that AB 900 project to have in place and have those positions in place. So I can keep repeating myself and sound frustrated, and I will probably just beat a dead horse here, and that's where I'm at.
I ask a clarifying question? I don't know if this is for Eric or Dan, but I notice in year one, it's a little over 9 million total budget. Year two, it's 9.68 million. And then it looks like it goes to 8.5 for year 3 and 4. Is that because the 8.5 is our typical CCP base budget? And the last couple of years, we've gotten like a bump for certain things. So we're anticipating kind of building the budget off that baseline 8.5 to start, and may see fluctuation like we see in fiscal year 2021 and 21-22.
Yes, effectively looking at the most conservative no growth option. So this is, I think, yes, looking at the most conservative option of the base budget with that 8.5 million, assuming no growth whatsoever. So it is possible it could be higher, but we just don't know at this time.
I mean, that to me speaks a little bit to Supervisor Saylor's point earlier, is that, we could agree to a framework percentage moving forward, and then it's an annual kind of budget process. So, depending on what projections are in the future, we may be talking about different actual dollar amounts here. It's still percentages, so it's still a cut for those departments, based on these options, obviously. But I think it's a much different dollar amount cut potentially if we're talking about 9.6 that comes in fiscal year 2022 versus the 8.5 that's on there now.
I'm not sure exactly where we go from this point.
Well, a lot of times people say, are you ready for a motion? And then you decide where the direction is. Or you can say, we're going to schedule it again for next week. So you got kind of either stop or you go.
Daniel, your box lit up. Did you have anything or?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment to Ian and Eric's point. My understanding is this number does fluctuate. We have a conservative assumption for 22-23. I think Tracy had pointed out earlier, depending on if we target certain populations, we might be able to be more strategic and grow the pot, in which case we could mitigate the reductions for certain departments. That may be in conjunction with potentially freezing vacant positions, or ensuring that when we attrit, we don't fill behind those positions. That could mitigate potential layoffs. So it seems like there are general principles kind of at play where we're talking about, we don't want to have layoffs. We want to grow the treatment dollars and the innovation funds. And we want to be more strategic about how can we grow the larger pot. So I think there's just the questions really are about how many years do we want to stagger this, and ultimately what do we want the percentages to land at? So it sounds like we're close. That said, like I said, any decisions made won't actually appear on the budget for several months until the second phase of the budget process, because we're too late into the process for the 21-22 budget proposal.
So I have a question. It's Jonathan. When Daniel, when you say grow the pot, so I know that we've talked about this second striker program. Honestly, I don't know that we really need a program, because I can tell you that the way we look at cases in our office, if someone has a strike, is our default is not to send them to prison. And that's probably changed from 10 years ago. So I'm not sure how many, and we don't send that many people to prison. So I'm not sure that there's going to be a great reduction there, even if we have a formal second striker program. So I'm curious, were there other ways that we can strategically grow the pot, or was it just that?
I heard about the second striker program, and that's my understanding. I'm not sure if there are other ways to grow the pot. I think, though, just based on what you said, another option for consideration is to have a minimum floor of funding. for departments. But then if assuming the $8.5 million of funding, but should there be additional growth beyond that 8.5 million, that it be allocated to those departments that would have seen a greater growth. Does that make sense?
I can also offer just a little more context on that. There's actually I think it's 6 pots of money that is the way the state does the allocation. So I will say at the end of the day, there are diminishing returns in the long run because it's based on your effectiveness and incarceration rates and success. So there's probably a threshold with how low those numbers can actually go. But there are 6 pots in which there can be successes, and then that could equivalent with outcomes and increased dollars. And so we do have that information as well that we gathered earlier this year from 2015 to 2016 through 2021. So that information is also available to show YOLO's share in comparison to the state share of those 6 different pots within the CCP pot, if that makes sense.
Phil, can I ask your opinion? Are we even agendized to go forward with the vote today?
Yeah, so Dan, you and I talked about that last week, and generally I'd say no. The way it's agendized, it says receive revised CCP budget ad hoc recommendation. I mean, I wouldn't go so far as to say a vote would clearly be unlawful because it would go beyond the scope of how this is agendized, but this certainly seems to contemplate discussion today and some sort of procedural motion to come back within the next few weeks to talk further and take action rather than take action today, in my view. Is that clear? Clear enough?
Fair enough, yes. Then I suppose we will have to set another meeting for next month, come back and vote on one of these 4 options. Oh, Karen had her hand up. Sorry, I didn't see that, Karen.
I raised it while you were talking. It's fine.
Oh, okay.
I think it would be helpful. I want to make sure that if the budget ad hoc is being asked to do something between now and the next meeting, we understand what we're being asked to do. And also, it feels like I didn't hear anybody expressing interest in or support for options 2 or 3. And so I'm wondering if we are really talking about options 1 and then the option that came in outside of the budget ad hoc process from Jonathan. So I'd like to understand if we're being asked to do something so we understand where our goalpost is.
Bill, your hand came up briefly. Was that a mistake or?
No, it was a separate thing. So I'll ask a bit later. Hold on.
Okay. That's a good question you raised, Karen. I heard the same thing too. It looks like there's the more interest in option 1 and 4 potentially. I don't know if that's, Phil, can we take a vote on that or? Sorry,
well, before we take a vote, my understanding to Karen's question is that the board members had, if we look at options 1 and 4, what would happen in terms of the additions to each department or the subtractions? What are the implications of those?
So I think that doesn't feel like a budget ad hoc request because the people on the budget ad hoc should not be saying what Dan or the sheriff's department is going to cut. Additionally, it feels like we're getting ahead of the process if we determine what is going to be added to treatment, for example, because just as a reminder, treatment isn't an HHSA line item. It is about several community-based organizations, and we are the pass-through, so we can draw down some additional state and federal funds for that. But it seems like we would be getting ahead of the process to say what we would be adding into that pot without the full CCP.
That's a good point. It would seem like we could at least identify the baseline funding right now, and then if there are going to be reductions, what those reductions would be for the departments that are getting reduced. Is that right?
And maybe, Daniel, I think that there was earlier information provided, and perhaps part of this is simply bringing that back to the table for the discussion that happens at the next meeting, the information on what the base spending is, and I think each of the departments did present some material on what their programs are, just so you have it all on the table at the same time was one thing. Maybe you don't have to do a lot of new work. I appreciated Chief Frutnick and Under Sheriff Johnson's comments about the impacts that they would see. Those impacts would vary from different levels, and I think looking at that would be helpful. I know it'd be helpful for our Board of Supervisors when this comes to us. We can guarantee that there's going to be a question about what the impact would be, regardless of what the change is. So I think you want to anticipate that. If we were going to do this in some ways, if we had made these decisions in 2011 and set it up with these percentages, we would have been probably better off to start that way. Hard to adjust now, but I think this is healthy discussion for us all. And I think today, for me, the discussion of the treatment as a sort of a opportunity to move into alternatives to incarceration, and frankly, even in treatment in incarcerated settings, was very helpful to begin to see that as almost a challenge grant kind of an approach, and weighing the benefit of that with the sunk cost in base budgets is going to be part of what you're going to have to do. And as the conversation went on, one last gratuitous thing, I think that Chief Miller's comment was pretty powerful for me, that you guys have been talking about this for years, and in some ways this budget ad hoc committee you commissioned has come back and said, let's get past this. Here's a way to go. Here's a way to do it. That was sort of a powerful comment, Chief.
Dale, your hand's up.
Yeah, I just want to go over a little bit more about the numbers that will be presented to the Sheriff's Office. And in year one, we will lose 7 correctional officer positions. Year 2, 3 more. And by that third year, another 3, for a total of 13 correctional officer positions is what we're looking at. So it is very impactful. A lot of times our budget is augmented by the general fund. So I can't even imagine having a conversation with 13 correctional officers saying we're going to have to lay you off. And then how's that going to be even possible when we have state mandated requirements to have those correctional officers in place at the jail? So we're going to have those positions filled by overtime. So it's going to be disastrous for our agency.
Is electronic monitoring run by correctional officers?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Eric, I don't know if you were taking super notes. I have a few, but do you know what's kind of being asked?
I do. So I'll do a quick recap and then we can test my abilities right now. So it sounds as if the focus in this discussion has been on options 1 and 4, although that hasn't been voted on or decided, but those have been the 2 options that have surfaced. We're looking to pair the data that we've previously collected. It's Monday. Look at the data that we previously collected earlier this year in terms of what we've actually been spending in terms of the CCP, and marrying that to the spreadsheet that the budget ad hoc has developed thus far, giving us a fuller picture of what are each of the line items, and then if possible looking to illustrate the additions or subtractions for the budget moving forward if there were to be hits taken or additions for the budget. And then also this concept of looking at a holistic treatment and alternative to our incarceration. So looking to see if there's a way that we can massage that into a pot of its own.
Is that, oh, Karen?
I heard also a request for a line item budget, and we didn't really close the loop on that. So are we taking Dan up on his offer to have his staff help us develop that line item budget?
Does that mean we're not doing percentage-based budgeting? I mean, that's kind of what Chief Miller was saying, is are we just tossing this out and starting over again?
I thought the line item budget was so he would know what was in each of the percentage pots, but maybe I misunderstood.
No. Oops, go ahead.
My understanding was this, that we have the baseline budget already, right? I think Chief Fruitnick was saying if we can get a little more detail on that. And then for options 1 and 4, we would identify if the departments are seeing reductions, what those reductions would actually mean in terms of bodies or services. And then to the extent that we can anticipate what the increases in funding would be for those departments that get more money, what that might potentially be.
Correct.
It would be a way of informing the conversation rather than recasting the recommendation.
Correct. That's my thoughts on it. That we stick with the plan of percentage based, but just kind of a further breakout of some of the things that we've already allocated, and kind of just more detail to it, but sticking with the percentage based.
You know, Dan, you did Daniel, Kim, you did a nice description of the areas of a principle. And of course, one of the principles you enumerated was avoid laying off current county employees. That doesn't mean that positions would not be wise to reduce. I mean, there may be positions that we would no longer, or reassigned, and so you can experience the reductions that would come from one of these options in a way that doesn't involve laying a person off, especially if you have a couple of years to do it. But I think we should be looking at, obviously we're looking at this as a funding source to achieve program outcomes, not as a full employment program for county employees. I don't want to sound like we ought to lay people off. Of course, we don't want to do that, but you have to make business decisions and programmatic decisions. And if we've got a program that we believe is not the best approach to achieve the goals of the strategic plan, then you need to reassign the resources to an area that will achieve the strategic plan. And I think that's kind of the electronic monitoring program is an example of something that we want to know more about. At some point, we're going to have to bring that back up. And if we've got people doing that, if we've got people being paid for that program, and the program is not being implemented for some reason, or is not being as effective as we would like it to be, then we should look at reassigning those positions within the jail operation and use the funds for the strategic plan for the CCP.
Sorry if I'm a little slow on the pickup today, but none of this feels like a budget ad hoc responsibility to me, if I'm interpreting correctly. It seems like what we're asking is each department to go back and say what the cuts are going to mean for them. We already have the line item detail on the budget. We could put it in a summary format, I guess, and come back next month for a vote on one of these options with a little more information for context to make that vote. Am I incorrect?
Along with that, would you want people to cast their ideas for like, hey, we think this position could be reframed under treatment, and this is why. So rather than probation saying, I'm going to lose 5 people, they could say, well, I have a DRC officer, and what I would probably want to do is see if the DRC officer would be treatment cost. It doesn't have to be just what are you going to cut? It could be how are we going to make this work given the different pots. Same, I think, with the jail. I think that student custody programming, maybe your, social worker could count as treatment.
Absolutely. I think that's, I don't want to speak for Eric, but I'll volunteer my staff as well. That might be something that between the two of us, we can get done. And that way it's not necessarily an ad hoc task.
And I'm not sure how you do this, but maybe part of that analysis for your staff, Dan, is, for example, in listening, I'm concerned if you're cutting pretrial release and there's more people in the jail as a result, that seems contrary to our goal here. But in addition to that, it increases, if we're sending more people back to jail, potentially increases incarceration costs and makes it more difficult to cut a correctional officer. In fact, we know what happens when we have too few correctional officers is, in order to meet legal requirements, they do overtime, and overtime costs even more than having that correctional officer position. So I guess I'm asking, let's keep in mind the bigger CCP / public safety budgets and how one impacts the other, because what we do one place affects something else.
Good points. If we keep it consistent, does June 14th work for the panel, which would be the second Monday? If it does not work for anybody, please speak up. Not seeing any issues. And I think we at least have a basic understanding of what Eric and my team will be putting together for next month. And we'll hold another special meeting dedicated to the budget on June 14th, 2021 at 1:30 p.m. With that being said, does anybody oppose adjournment? Seeing nobody. I appreciate everybody's time. We'll see you soon.